Today, I'd like to start out with a question that might be a little bit odd for this group. Question is, does God exist? Now, that might be a little bit odd because a lot of us, hopefully, follow what Hebrews 11, verse 6 says, that God is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him and who believe that He not only exists, but, of course, understand that He is a rewarder of those who trust in Him. But here at services, we do have visitors who have not yet made a decision on this way of life. We have people who have not yet made the decision for baptism. And even those of us who have, it's good to be reminded of some of these things, I think, as we interact in a world which is increasingly secular. We interact with people who do not rely upon the authority of the Bible, consider it perhaps at best a book of wisdom, and at worst a divisive text which has led to numerous wars and complications in society. And so I wanted to go into this question today. If you've not yet considered the question, I ask you to consider it from a secular standpoint, because if you ask, does God exist? Well, the answer you might say, well, of course He does. And then I'd say, well, how do you know He exists? And you say, well, because the Bible says He exists. Or you might say, because I've proven His existence in my own research. Well, if you're talking to a skeptic, if you're talking to somebody who does not accept the authority of the Bible, you can't necessarily use the Bible to share why you believe God exists. And perhaps you haven't looked at that, but we're going to look at some of these things today. I want to discuss 3 proofs of God's existence without using the Bible. Without using the Bible. We're still going to read Bible verses because this is a sermon, so we should put our nose in the Bible. But if we want to discuss this issue with our skeptical friends, we should have a few arguments, a few proofs in mind. And as a backdrop to these 3 proofs that we're going to go through, we're going to look at how the Apostle Paul spoke to what I would consider a comparable audience of his time. How he wrote to the church in Rome about these matters. And of course, Rome was the center of the world of his time, and certainly not a place where there was only one religion. There were all sorts of different views and religions, a whole melting pot of things in Rome. And also we're going to look at how he spoke to the Athenians about this topic. And that was quite I think, a comparable time to us today. Now, there's more than 3 proofs. There's actually many that we could discuss, but for sake of time, I'm just going to go through these 3, and hopefully you might remember these 3. If I gave you a whole bunch and I didn't go into some details, it might be a little bit harder to remember. And I think they'll suffice to show that there are arguments that are critically examined, have stood the test of time, are sound, and are sufficient to overturn or at least to stand up to any atheistic viewpoints on this topic. So the title of today's message is 3 Proofs of God's Existence. And I want to begin with Romans 1, verse 20. As I said, we'll look at what Paul wrote to the Romans because I think it provides a good starting point for a discussion about God's existence. Romans 1, verse 20, we see Paul says here, "For since the creation of the world, His, that is God's invisible attributes, are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." So Paul summarizes a key concept in the proof of God's existence here. It is the argument that we can see God's invisible attributes through the things that God has made. We can look at this physical world and consciously assess the existence of a creator, of a being who created these things, and we can draw conclusions from what we see. So much so that Paul goes so far as to say that those who deny that God exists are without excuse. That's how far. It's not enough that we just sort of understand that God exists, we're without excuse, because it should be so clear from what we see around us. And we'll use this principle to evaluate the evidence for God's existence in this sermon. There's also an increasingly widespread modern Western paradigm that says that if you believe in God, you must be anti-science, potentially a little irrational, maybe somewhat narrow-minded, not very cultured, right? We could go on, right? These kinds of things that are thrown around. And in this paradigm, intelligent people are atheists, but that's really not quite true. And I don't want you to take my word for it. I want to share with you a Pew Research study. This was from 2017. It's titled, "In America, Does More Education Equal Less Religion?" Does more education equal less religion? Let me read from this because I think it's interesting. The idea that highly educated people are less religious on average than those with less education has been part of the public discourse for decades. But some scholars of religion have called this notion into question. And a new analysis of Pew Research Center survey shows that the relationship between religion and education in the United States is not so simple. Highly educated Americans are less inclined than others to say they believe in God with absolute certainty and to pray on a daily basis. There is a connection there. On the other hand, Americans with college degrees report attending religious services as often as Americans with less education. Moreover, the majority of American adults identify as Christians in the United States, and among Christians, those with higher levels of education appear to be just as religious as those with less schooling on average. In fact, highly educated Christians are more likely than less educated Christians to say they are weekly churchgoers. And I find that quite very much to fly in the face of sort of what you might hear on the news, that highly educated Christians are more likely than less educated to say. And when they use these terms, they talk about those who have a postgraduate degree versus a college degree versus some college versus high school. And that's kind of the variations. This study was done 7 years ago, and I think there's been an overall downward trend in regard to church attendance in the United States in the last 7 years. But I thought it was interesting how the data makes clear that this notion of education equals not believing in God, or in this case, attending church, doesn't actually hold up. It doesn't actually hold up to scrutiny. One example cited in the March-April 2012 issue of the Good News magazine is that of Oxford University professor Anthony Flew, a leading atheist for most of his life. How many have read this story? People familiar with the story? They're not familiar with the story. He was a leading atheist, very well-known atheist actually, for most of his life. In 2004, at the age of 81, he stunned the world by declaring that there must be an intelligent creator of the universe. So this is a man who taught at Oxford for decades, very well known. You can read his book. It's entitled, "There Is a God, How the World's Most Famous Atheist Changed His Mind." Very interesting story. Even Richard Dawkins, many of us might be familiar with that name, arguably today one of the most famous atheists. Dr. Flew died a number of years ago. I read Richard Dawkins' book. It's one of his more famous books called The God Delusion. And on page 135 of that book, he says that the origin of life, that is life from non-life, which is what he believes, in his words, these are his words, is an extremely improbable event. So this is even according to Richard Dawkins, life from non-life. So it's hard even for great atheist thinkers to argue for life from nothing. Elon Musk, very well-known figure to all of us here, probably one of the greatest entrepreneurs of our modern age, the founder of SpaceX, Tesla, and many other companies, has said there's a one in a, actually the quote is, there's 1 in billions chance, I think 1 in a billion, or 1 in billions, that we're in base reality, which for those familiar with computer simulation means it's likely that we're actually living in a big computer simulation created by a super intelligent being. So essentially the view is that AI that we see right now is becoming more and more intelligent, that very likely, according to Musk, somewhere out in the universe, some other intelligent species coming along in the same sort of path created this super intelligent AI, and they created simulations, and then we're just part of that simulation. You can think about that. This idea is actually shared by Neil deGrasse Tyson. I actually enjoy listening to him. I think he's kind of funny and a very deep thinker. I actually read a lot of Carl Sagan as a young man growing up, and he kind of picked up from Dr. Sagan. He has declared that the chances of us living in a computer simulation are about 50-50. And you can see interviews with Dr. deGrasse Tyson about this, about how chances are we're living in some kind of computer simulation. So this, there's so many different ideas out there to basically come up with something else besides life came from non-life. But even if you believe in aliens or some sort of computer simulation or some sort of other thing, you have to ask the question, who created the aliens, right? At some point, it just kind of keeps going back to the same thing. I'd like to quote here an alternative view from Dr. Edward Fesser, because I think this is sort of now where we're beginning to get into some of the proofs. Alternatively, Dr. Edward Fesser, who's an associate professor of philosophy at Pasadena City College. Pasadena City College, I actually had a chance to go there. It's not far from Ambassador, where I went to undergrad. It's across the street from the California Institute of Technology, fairly storied institution. I think Albert Einstein opened one of its science departments there. Anyway, he's an associate professor of philosophy at Pasadena City College and visiting assistant professor of philosophy at Loyola Marymount. He wrote in the he's regarded by the National Review as one of the best contemporary writers on philosophy today. He was an atheist, Dr. Fesser. He pretty much grew up not believing in God until he went and got his doctorate at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he came to understand through his studies that there must be a creator. So here's a person who was an atheist as a young man, and then as he studied more, he realized this does not make any sense. And he has a book out called The 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. I'm about halfway through it. It's a rougher read because it's a lot of philosophy. But I'd like to quote from his book, 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. This is what he says: "A long line of thinkers from the beginnings of Western thought down to the present day, Aristotelians, Neoplatonists, Thomists, scholastics, early modern rationalists, and philosophers of other schools too, whether pagans, Jews, Christians, Muslims, or philosophical theists, have affirmed that God's existence can be rationally demonstrated by purely philosophical arguments." So Paul told the Romans that they were without excuse. And I believe that as we progress in our scientific understanding and our knowledge increases, the truth of the Bible's claims will become more and more evident. I think this was once described as the great thinkers and scientists of the world, as they mount the great mountains of knowledge, of understanding, will finally arrive to the summit and find a group of theologians standing there waiting for them. So that's how Paul considered talking to the Romans. Let's turn over to Acts 17 and look at how he spoke to the Greeks. Acts 17, verse 16. Paul was an educated man. At the time, literacy was quite low in the Roman Empire. Across the Roman Empire, I had statistics on that. I won't quote that. You can look that up. But he was a literate man, a studied man, and I believe was familiar with the great Greek schools of philosophy. Look over at Acts 17, verse 16, and let's pick up the story of his discussion with the philosophers in Athens and how he described God and who God is. Now, while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him when he saw that when he saw that the city was given over to idols. Therefore, he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and with the Gentile worshipers, and in the marketplace daily with those who happened to be there. So Paul's standing there in the marketplace in the public square, and he's talking about God. He's talking about who God is, not sort of the pantheon of the Greek gods of Apollo and Zeus and so forth, and not the Roman gods, and not the gods of the various other peoples that were in the cities, but of the true God. And we see that he reasoned there in the public square. And then it says, then certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered him. And some said, what does this babbler want to say? And others said, he seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods because he preached to them Jesus and the resurrection. Now, we might go quickly over this, but let's just pause here for a second and ask, who were the Epicureans? Because this is a detail that Luke puts into this passage that we should not skip over quickly. Who were the Epicureans? Epicureanism, in the strictest sense, is a philosophy taught by Epicurus. Epicurus lived in the second and third century before the Common Era. So this school of the Epicureans was about 300 years old at the time when Paul was speaking here in Athens. I want to quote to you from the Encyclopedia Britannica. It says, several fundamental concepts characterize the philosophy of Epicurus. Now try and stay with me here because it's a little technical, and the reason that I went ahead and just did this is because I wanted to kind of try and put you there of Paul speaking with Epicurean philosophers, okay? These people would be speaking like this, okay? So just try and stay with me. In physics, these are atomism, a mechanical conception of causality, limited, however, by the idea of a spontaneous motion or swerve of the atoms, which interrupts the necessary effect of a cause, the infinity of the universe, and the equilibrium of all forces that circularly enclose its phenomena, and the existence of gods, conceived as beautified and immortal natures completely extraneous to happenings in the world. That is, they're kind of out here, and they're not really involved with the world. In ethics, the natures completely extraneous to the happenings, In ethics, the basic concepts are the identification of good with pleasure. That's why what we often associate with the Epicureans is pleasure. And of the supreme good and ultimate end of the absence of pain from the body and the soul. A limit beyond which pleasure does not grow but changes. The reduction of every human relationship to the principles of utility, which finds its highest expression in friendship, in which is at the same time surmounted, and in accordance with this end, the limitation of all desire and the practice of virtues from which pleasure is inseparable. So you can imagine these people, these Epicureans, they're having these conversations, these philosophical conversations with Paul, and they're like, you're nuts, Paul. I don't know what you're talking about. And others like, wow, this is interesting what you're saying. How does this tie into what Epicurus said? And then there were the Stoics. And I think it's not a coincidence that he chose the Epicureans and the Stoics to mention here in Scripture. Who were the Stoics? Again, quoting from the Encyclopedia Britannica. It says here that in principle, Epicurus's ethic, so the Epicureans, of pleasure, is the exact opposite of the Stoics' sense of duty. So the Epicureans and the Stoics were on the opposite ends of the philosophical spectrum. For the Stoics, reason alone could reveal the constancy of the cosmic order. I'm quoting from Encyclopedia Britannica. And the originative source of unyielding value. Thus, reason became the true model for human existence. To the Stoic, virtue is an inherent feature of the world, no less inexorable in relation to humans than the laws of nature. So you had over here good and pleasure, and over here you had reason and duty. And so Luke is giving us a sense that you pretty much have the entire spectrum of philosophers that Paul was interacting with in Athens. So then if we continue in verse 19, and they took him and they brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new doctrine is of which you speak? For you are bringing some strange things to our ears. Therefore we want to know what these things mean." For all the Athenians and the foreigners who were there spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or to hear some new thing. And there we have it. So we have the Epicureans all the way to the Stoics and everything in between, all being discussed and summarized here. So what might this include? Well, you have the Pythagoreans. Remember your triangles from school? He's more than triangles, actually. There's a whole school of thought. You had the Socratic, who followed Plato, the Peripatetic, who followed the teachings of Aristotle. You had those who followed Heraclitus. And Heraclitus is interesting because he was the first person to use the word logos, which we're very familiar with. The logos, as he described it, was used to describe the reasoning of human beings, the power of our reasoning, but the Stoics later redefined it to describe the active, rational, and spiritual principles that permeate reality. That is some sort of reality that's beyond the physical, that is God or the soul of the universe. And I don't think it's a coincidence that John chose this word logos to describe the word, because people of that time could understand that kind of concept. So he's got everybody's attention now. And now he's going to talk about God. He's going to talk about God. And is he going to quote the Old Testament? Let's see what he does. Then Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious. For as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, I found an altar with an inscription, 'To the unknown God.' Therefore the one whom you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you." And then he goes back to what he said to the Romans. God, who made the world and everything in it, since he is the Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he worshipped with man's hands as though he needed anything, since he gives to all life breath and all things. And he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and their boundaries of their habitation. And he goes on to describe who this God is to a group of people that had no basis really in Scripture other than perhaps kind of as an aside to their philosophy. And so he goes on and he continues describing this all the way down, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. And for sake of time, I won't continue reading the rest of this, but I think you get the idea that Paul was prepared and ready to discuss his view of who God was and how he was going to share that to that kind of audience. And so in the spirit of Paul's instruction here, and in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1, where he says, "Imitate me as I imitate Christ," let us together examine the philosophies of our modern world so that we might be educated and prepared to share our faith with those who may not currently accept biblical instruction or believe that there is a God. So let's look at the first proof. The first proof is called the unmoved mover. The unmoved mover. And let's go over to Hebrews 11, verse 3, because again, these things exist outside of philosophy and actually in Scripture, so let's root ourselves in Scripture on these things. Hebrews 11, in verse 3, it says, "By faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible." So this is the unmoved mover proof. In other words, God caused the world to be created. He is the creator. He is the first mover. So this is one of the oldest views of the proof, the philosophical proof of the existence of a creator. It was actually formed by Aristotle, who lived between 384 and 322 BC. His argument is often called the argument from motion. The argument from motion, or the argument from change. And it's summarized, I'll summarize it from Dr. Fesser's book, 5 Proofs of God Existence. Dr. Fesser writes that everything changes, like coffee that goes cold, or a leaf that falls. Whatever happens, something is changed by something else. For example, the coffee becomes cold. Now we know that coffee has the potential to be cold, and that this potential is actualized by cold air. So if you have a cup of coffee that's hot, it's hot. How does it become cold? Well, something has to act on that cup of coffee to make it cold. So that change from hot to cold requires a changer. Something has to act on that. The coldness of the coffee didn't exist before you put it down on the table. It wasn't there, and then it appeared. That is, it became cold. Now we read in John 1:1 that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And John 1:1 is based upon Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So that's the prime mover. That's the first motion. Isaac Newton's first law states that every object will remain at rest or in uniform motion in a straight line unless compelled to change its state by the action of an external force. This is fundamental science. The question is, what was the original external force? What's the original external force? There's a 13th century monk named Thomas Aquinas. Many of us might be familiar with him. He wrote about this. He called it the proof of motion. We observe motion all around us. Whatever is in motion now, I'm moving. Before was at rest. I was sitting back over there. And then you have sort of this infinite series of things that go back. Now, this doesn't have to be hierarchical by going back in time. Sometimes we think about it going back in time. You can think about it in the simplest as the present state. So let me give you an example. The coffee that you might have goes cold because there was air conditioning in the room, which cooled the coffee. Because you turned on the air conditioning, because you were too hot, because it was hot in the room, because it was summer and the earth was closer to the sun, because something brought the earth closer to the sun. And then you keep kind of going and going and going until you get to the Big Bang. Right? Eventually you get back to the Big Bang. Now, some atheists maintain that the Big Bang was caused by the collapse of an earlier universe, and that this causal link goes back to infinity. So this is one of the arguments against it. Well, you just keep going back infinitely. There is no first mover because you have an infinite series of events going all the way back into infinity. The problem with this argument for eternity is that it does raise the concept of infinity. Now, again, stay with me. From a scientific point of view, the concept of infinity is an illogical argument. It's just an illogical argument. Now, and perhaps you've had fun with this. I'm going to quote William Lane Craig, who studied it. Infinity is not a logical, scientific, mathematical concept. For example, infinity minus infinity. What's the answer there? Infinity minus infinity equals infinity. If you remove all the odd numbers from an infinite set of numbers, okay, you're going to take all the odd numbers, which would be half of all numbers. Not really, but you can think of it that way. How many numbers are you left with? An infinite set of numbers. If you subtract all the numbers greater than 3 from an infinite set of numbers, right? Your brain can't get around it. So the problem with the infinite universe theory is it's scientifically illogical. You can't mathematically prove that. So you have to have a prime mover. And so the Big Bang, according to many scientists, is actually one of the greatest proofs of God's existence, because it really, you do have this moment where there's just nothing and then there's something. And how did that happen? And so that is one of the early proofs, going all the way back to Aristotle, discussed by Thomas Aquinas, reprised by Dr. Edward Feser today, and should be something that you should just have in your toolkit when you talk about, does God exist? The prime mover, the argument for motion. Did I use the Bible? Well, kind of. We were in Hebrews 11, we were in John 1:1, we were in Genesis 1, so you think it's a sermon, so I'm using the Bible. But again, if you're going to use that argument, that's just the argument. Let's look at the second proof of God's existence. This is the argument from consciousness. Consciousness. Let's look over at Ecclesiastes 3, verse 11, to root this in Scripture. This is the argument from consciousness. Ecclesiastes 3, verse 11. I think it's such an interesting verse. Solomon writes here in Ecclesiastes 3, verse 11, He, that is God, has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, He has put eternity in their hearts, speaking of us as human beings, except that no one can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. God is just so infinite. But there's something interesting. He says that God has put eternity in our hearts. Now that's kind of an illogical concept, but it's nonetheless a concept that from God. Eternity is a concept that humans have conceived as part of what we call consciousness. Consciousness. What is consciousness? And this question has been studied at length. So we have consciousness, dogs have consciousness, but scientifically we don't think dogs are aware of their own consciousness. So something unique about humans is we are conscious of our consciousness. We are aware of our own existence. But in any case, how can consciousness be described by atoms alone? Is there a non-material element in the universe called consciousness, or is consciousness just something that springs from material nature in our brains? Now, this argument around the existence of God from consciousness has been made at different times. I'm going to quote from Dr. James Moreland. This was in an interview with Dr. Robert Kuhn on the U.S. television program Closer to Truth. How many have seen the program Closer to Truth? Anybody? Nobody here? Okay. Closer to Truth is one of the longest-running science programs on public broadcasting television. I think it ran for 17 years. It was hosted by Dr. Robert Lawrence Kuhn. Some people know who Dr. Kuhn is. I'm looking at some of you. Dr. Kuhn was a member of the Worldwide Church of God in the 1960s and 70s. He's an expert on Chinese affairs. Scientist. Anyway, interesting. He lives in Southern California, as far as I know, still alive today. You might listen to this. I think he was influenced by his time in the church. Anyway, Dr. Kuhn interviewed Dr. James Moreland, who's an American philosopher, a theologian, and a Christian apologist. Dr. Moreland is and I still check that still today, a distinguished professor of philosophy at the Talbot School of Theology at Biola University in California. So this is what Dr. Moreland states. You cannot describe conscious states using the language of physical science. If you start the universe with a Big Bang, which most people accept now, and all you have is matter, and the history of the universe is a history of the laws of chemistry and physics taking chunks of matter and rearranging them into increasingly larger and more complicated chunks of matter according to physical chemical law, you're not going to get consciousness. You're not going to get consciousness squirting into existence because you cannot get something from nothing. If you start with matter without mind, you will get more complicated chunks of matter, but you won't get mind coming into consciousness or into existence. So you have to start the universe with mind, with consciousness being fundamental. You have to have some kind of consciousness or mind at the very beginning. Otherwise, you won't end up with it at the end. Now, he goes on to say that doesn't get you to God yet, he says, because there are two worldviews on this. Panpsychism is a worldview. It's a fundamental feature of matter is that it is conscious. So there is one view that all matter, this, everything, is conscious. That is it's called panpsychism. He says that's not a scientific view of matter. The second theory is that there was a conscious being in the beginning. A conscious being, in his view, is a better explanation for this. You never find a case of consciousness without it belonging to a subject. If the universe begins with consciousness, therefore that consciousness must belong to a subject. Conscious states are owned. God exists because we are conscious beings, and this consciousness had to come into being. Our consciousness can only be explained, our consciousness cannot be explained by atoms and material elements. So, essentially, the very fact that we are having this experience right now cannot be defined by atoms, chemistry, or matter that somehow came together in our brains. And you can study into this. I find this some of the most fascinating parts of studying into some of these subjects, because you really have a very lively debate on this topic by some of the greatest scientific minds that exist today. Does consciousness naturally spring from the neurons and the electrical impulses that are going on in our brain, or is it a non-material thing? I think it's a non-material thing based on what I read in Scripture, based upon this concept of how did I get this? Where did this come from? And according to Dr. Moreland, it came from the very beginning. At the Big Bang, consciousness, a conscious being was part of that, and that same consciousness came all the way down to me. So that's the argument from consciousness. There is a corollary that I'll just throw in there but for sake of time I won't go into it, and that is the concept of free will. Free will is also a very controversial topic, because free will argues from consciousness. How can you exercise free will unless you're conscious to exercise it? And so there are theories out there that when you got up this morning and you decided to put on whatever you were putting on today, that you didn't actually choose that was actually a series of electrical impulses and atoms and DNA and proteins that you inherited from your family that led you to choose red or blue or whatever you chose, and that you actually have no free will at all to choose what you put on today. That is a scientific argument that you can go out and look at. Now, that seems kind of absurd to me, probably to you too, but again, if you're going to talk about free will, you have to talk about consciousness, and if you're going to talk about consciousness, you're going to have to talk about where that came from. So the argument from consciousness is a second proof of God's existence that I hope you can put in your toolkit. The third proof of God's existence is the argument from creation, which may be somewhat intuitive, but let's look over in Psalm 19, and we've read different references to this, but let's look in Psalm 19, and we'll read verses 2 to 6. Psalm 19, verse 2. We'll actually start in verse 1. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. There's a reference in my Bible, the expanse of heaven show the works of his hands. Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge. That is just seeing how the sun goes around the earth. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Their line has gone out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them he has set a tabernacle for the sun, which is like a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, and rejoices like a strong man to run its race. Its rising is from one end of heaven, and its circuit to the other end. And there is nothing hidden from its heat. Beautiful poetic language to describe this miracle that we see every day of the earth and the sun and the moon working together. God has placed the earth in its proper place in the solar system and in the galaxy, and he's done so in such a way as to offer us a very, very special place, one that scientists and great thinkers have understood to be exceptional. This is an exceptional place. As scientists study, more and more things come out about how exceptional this place is that we live. I want to quote from a March 2018 National Geographic magazine, which published an article entitled One Strange Rock, talking about our Earth, that describes 13 elements that made life on Earth possible. Again, not quoting the Bible, quoting National Geographic. Science magazine, Science Facts. Here's 13 unique things about the Earth. Our planet recycles life-giving carbon over time. We have an ozone layer that blocks harmful rays. We have a large moon to stabilize our axial oscillation. The Earth's varied surfaces are home to many forms of life. Our magnetic field deflects solar storms. We are at the perfect distance from our sun. We are located at a distance that protects us from the gas giants in the outer solar system. The sun is a stable, long-lasting star. We have what is needed for a dynamic Earth core. That is the core of the Earth spinning. We have giant planets like Jupiter to protect us from comets. Our sun offers protection from galactic debris. Our galactic trajectory keeps us out of harm's way. Our location is far from crowded stellar spaces, right? That would be throwing off all sorts of terrible things that would probably incinerate us. So this argument argues that there are simply too many conditions that had to be perfectly aligned to allow the presence of life. There's just too many things that had to go right for us to be here. When we consider these examples, we get a better idea of the meaning of God's quote in Genesis 1:31, which says, God saw everything he made, and it was very good. Galactic debris. Who thinks about the galactic debris? But we're set up, protected from galactic debris. Now, this argument becomes even more powerful when combined with the Fermi paradox. How many people are familiar with the Fermi paradox? A couple. Okay. The Fermi paradox. Italian-American physicist and creator of the world's first nuclear reactor, Dr. Enrico Fermi, first invoked the idea of the Earth's uniqueness in what is now known as the Fermi paradox. I've listened to podcasts on this. I think there was one, This American Life, where Ira Glass is interviewing somebody, and they're talking about the Fermi paradox. And basically this interview is like, could it be we're alone? It's just so frightening for people to imagine. So this is the Fermi paradox. The Fermi paradox poses the question, where are the aliens? Where are the aliens? That's the Fermi paradox. So here's his paradox. This is what he wrote. There are billions of sun-like stars in the galaxy. Billions. Actually, I think it's billions and billions of now. This was, I think, in the 50s or 60s. Some of you might know better. There are billions of sun-like stars in the galaxy, many of them billions of years older than our solar system. These are facts that we understand today. With high probability, some of these stars have Earth-like planets. And if Earth is typical, some may have developed intelligent life. This would be very logical. Some of these civilizations may have developed interstellar travel, a step the Earth is currently studying. Even at the slow pace of interstellar travel currently envisioned, the entire Milky Way galaxy could be traversed in just a few million years. Just a few million years, okay? But again, we're talking enormous amounts of time. Based on these scientific facts, Dr. Fermi asked the question, where are the extraterrestrials? Where is everybody? Because there should be lots of people. Well, beings. Earth must have been visited by extraterrestrials. In an informal conversation, Fermi found no convincing evidence of this. Enrico Fermi was one of the world's greatest scientists. He is only one of 16 scientists who have a periodic table element named after him, okay? This is not a fringe guy. This is one of the great luminaries of modern science. The Fermi paradox is currently one of the great mysteries of the universe. And despite nearly 60 years of scientific effort to contact life in the universe, we have found nothing. And you can study about all the work that's been done on the SETI project and so forth. So it's fair to ask whether we're alone in the universe. Could what we have on this earth be unique? Could we be uniquely created by a being who we call God, set in this earth, reconciled to him through the sacrifice of another being, together forming the Godhead? That's the third proof of God's existence, the proof from creation. And I threw in the Fermi paradox because I think it just adds a little extra weight to that one. So where does this leave us? So I've presented three proofs for the existence of God, three arguments among many. And in the famous words of one author, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. I really don't. To me, it's too overwhelming in terms of this evidence. It's simply too difficult to try and understand the world around us without some kind of intelligent conception, some kind of intelligent design. Look over in Hebrews 2, verse 10 in conclusion then. Hebrews 2. And again, I am not a scientist, but I've talked to many, and this is, I think, the third time I've kind of reviewed this subject. I've been working on this for probably at least a decade. There is so much here, and I look forward to having discussions afterwards. And again, everything I've shared with you, there's arguments that, these things are very intensely debated. But that's all we have to do, is get to the debate, right? These are not frivolous arguments. These are not arguments that are easily dismissed. These are arguments that have stood the test of time and are difficult to refute. Hebrews 2, verse 10. For it was fitting for him, for whom all things and by whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to make the author of their salvation perfect through sufferings. For both he who sanctifies and those who are being sanctified are all of one, for which reason he is not ashamed to call them brethren. So there's an argument for God's existence. But what kind of God are we talking about? We're talking about a God who is involved in our lives, who is a Redeemer, who died for us that we might be reconciled to him. As I said in the introduction, it's not enough to believe that God exists. There is evidence that he is involved in his creation, and he has a plan for me and for you. And that project involves the creation of a family, Jesus Christ, who was God from the beginning and who has reconciled us to God. So that's the next big question on the road to understanding who and what God is. And I hope that this has at least motivated you to study into this more and be prepared and to feel some sense of strength to stand up to these atheistic arguments, because there are many proofs for God's existence that we don't need to go to the Bible for.